everybody. Today on the show, I'm so excited to have Dr. Morgan Francis joining us. She is a licensed counselor and a doctor of clinical psychology, and she will be here to talk to us a little bit about this word that almost every single one of us has experienced at one time or another, which is grief. I think now more than ever, as a global community, we are experiencing this together. And as Dr. Francis will talk to us about, it really is something where um, grief can range so much in scope from, losing a parent or a loved one to having your routine change or a loss of job, or, there's such a wide variety of spaces in which grief can live. So I'm so excited to have you here today to share some tools with our audience to help support them during this time. Before we dive in, I want to ask you, how are you doing over there managing as a mom, as a business owner, as somebody who's supporting so many people during this time? How are you navigating everything?
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me back on. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's so great to see your face. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm pivoting, right? I think we all are learning to pivot, learning to navigate through uncertainty, which I hope we can start, talking about a little bit too. And most of all, I'm really working on communication with my husband because, as you mentioned, I have three children, 8, 6, and 4. We are homeschooling. We are switching roles. I'm at my office serving mental health. He's at home doing homeschooling. And, as I was kind of sharing with you earlier before we hopped on here, it's been like a huge role reversal because I'll come home and I'll be like, what did you do all day? And because he's been working so incredibly hard. But it's been so great because we've both made a collective effort to engage in play, making sure we are identifying what we need for our own mental health as a couple. And I would say we have had some really great conversations. So we're learning, we're adapting, we're pivoting, and we're trying to make this work like everybody is.
Oh, good for you. When you say you've identified things that you need for mental health, what does that look like for you? Like, what are your 3 things, if you had to list 3, that are really pivotal in making sure that you can show up as your best self?
Absolutely. So for me, it's a routine. So I need to have a routine, especially in the morning when I wake up. So I really like to be able to get my coffee. I like to be able to meditate or use gratitude for about 5 minutes. I mean, frankly, that's all I can have time for.
Yeah. Me too,
And,
girl.
yeah. And then the second thing I love to do is move my body. So whatever that may look like, if that's just going for a nice light walk with my dog, if that is getting on my Peloton bike, if that is sitting and doing some deep breathing exercises, if that means running around with my kids in the backyard, that is my second thing. And then my third thing is I need to have adventure. So really one of the things that we've done, and I'm really lucky. I live in Arizona, so the weather's been beautiful. There's amazing trails. We have been finding new places to go and explore. So there are beautiful parts of Arizona that my family and I, we get in our minivan, we pack up our lunches, peanut butter and jellies, and we put our sunscreen on and we go out and we just walk and we explore. And it's been so amazing to have these conversations with my little ones as we are, and it's been great. Like, they look forward to it every weekend. Like, what are we going to go now? So that's
So
been really been very important for my mental health.
So fun. And I love that you mentioned routine as well, because I think that is something that so many people struggled with or are struggling with in regards to all the changes that are happening, all of a sudden having to work from home and their whole routine being thrown out the window. So it is one of those things I find too, that especially that morning part kind of creates this anchor for the whole day and sets the tone for the whole day. But I'm with you on the fact that it doesn't always have to take 3 hours. Sometimes it's a 10-minute, piece of time or chunk of time that you're able to create for yourself. And that's enough. That's good enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's dive into this conversation around grief. And full disclosure, as I was preparing for this, I was like, why am I finding it so hard to come up with questions for her? And then I was like, you know what? Other than losing my grandparents, which of course was sad and hard to go through, but it didn't feel traumatic. It didn't feel traumatic because they were all well into their 80s and 90s. So there was a loss for sure, but it didn't feel traumatic. I don't feel like I have experienced grief in the way that I imagine it to be. Knock on wood, I can't even handle that I'm saying this because I feel like the universe is going to give me some opportunity to work through grief, which I'm okay with the fact that this is like the one thing I feel like I haven't had to navigate. So I was finding it hard to come up with questions because I hadn't been through that experience. And I'm curious to know, is it normal to like, is it possible to experience grief in other ways than through death?
Yes. And to be honest with you, most people share exactly the same sentiment as you just did. They think that they have to have gone through something really traumatic in order to understand grief and loss, such as the death of a child or the loss of a parent or a sibling. And the reality is, we experience grief and loss way before we actually lose a person in our life. We may experience grief and loss by the attachments that we were or were not provided in our childhood. So if we were rejected, if we were abandoned, if we were told to be quiet, to be seen and not heard, if we were told that we're not good enough, if we were kind of cast aside because our parents were going through maybe something of their own, then that in itself is a loss. If you've been in heartache of a breakup of relationship, if you've been through a loss of a job, if you've been through the loss of a pet, if you've, thought like, hey, this is like this plan of your business, of your entrepreneurship. And then with COVID, all of a sudden you've completely lost your financing, you've lost your backing, you've had to use your savings that you swore to yourself you would never touch, but that's the only way you can keep your business afloat. That is all loss. And so I really encourage people to broaden their definition around grief and loss and recognize that you and all of us have been through loss again and again and again. We just didn't know that that's what it was.
So right off the bat, I noticed that when you're describing grief, you're using the word loss almost always in conjunction with it. So is grief the emotion that is attached to the loss of something?
Yes, exactly. So the loss of something is tangible, and then grief is the emotional experience with it. But grief can show
Mm.
up as anxiety. Grief can show up as depression. Grief can show up as sadness, confusion, anger. It can show up as in a whole host of different experiences depending upon the person. So what I try to do is I try to make sure that I explain that there are three, I call them U's, like the letter U, to grief, to help everybody
Okay.
understand their own grief process. Would that be helpful for me to go into for you?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yes.
So, as you mentioned before, with COVID and the pandemic, right now we are experiencing the first U, and that's universal. So, right now, our grief is universally experienced, worldwide. We've all had to, really develop a new normal. Things have been taken away from us: concerts, traveling, family gatherings, church, sporting events, all the things that we took for granted, like handshakes and hugs, all
Yes.
have been canceled or taken away. And so we are experiencing this as a universal loss.
Mm.
So we all, on some level, can what it's called collective grieving. We all collectively are grieving universally together as a world. Now, the second U stands for unique. So, what I mean by this is your loss is unique to you, just as my loss is unique to me. A
Mm.
moment ago, which again is very common, you were expressing something along the lines of, well, I just don't know if it's that significant for me because I haven't experienced loss as someone over there, right? Meaning like they've had it worse.
Yeah.
And I see this all the time with people when even it comes to trauma. Like, well, I haven't had it as bad as this person. And the reality is, yes, that is true. There is always going to be somebody that you can find that's had it worse than you. but the pendulum swings both ways.
Hmm.
So just as much as you can find somebody who has had it worse, I bet you can find somebody who hasn't had as bad as you. And so it's really important that we refrain from moving into comparative suffering, because anytime we do that, really we're sending this indirect or subconscious message to our experience that our pain is not worthy of being seen and being heard or mattering. And
Hmm.
that's really what we need to do, is we need to be able to allow everyone's unique experience with grief to be what is meaningful for them, because everybody deserves to be seen, heard, and matter, right?
Mm, I love that. And I hear that all the time with my clients too, not so much in regards to grief, but in regards to relationships with food and their body. Well, I don't have it as bad as her, or my weight never got to that point. And it really doesn't. It doesn't take away from their own experience at all. So I'm so happy that you mentioned that. Why is it important to own our grief, to own our emotions, and to not move into that thinking pattern of, well, I should just be grateful for what I have, or my experience wasn't as bad as their experience. There's that constant conversation that we're hearing about positive psychology and giving gratitude and recognizing all that you have. But I also think that there's a certain level of importance in regards to allowing what you're feeling to truly express.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you. I think it's really helpful to have gratitude and to try to see what is this trying to teach me.
Mhm.
There's like a lesson in everything that that happens. It's not happening to us; it's happening for us. But here's the reality: when you've gone through a traumatic experience of grief and loss, if you've lost your business, if you've lost your job, you really are not going to be in a place where you're accepting the loss, right? I'm never going to accept the fact that if a child died or a parent died or a sibling died, like that's just not going to happen. So what's going to be much more effective, and this is again kind of down the road, is to be able to find meaning. So
Mm.
meaning is basically one of the stages of grief, which I can go into for you a little bit here. That's most recently added by Dr. David Kessler. And he, after losing his son, he was able to identify, there's meaning in this loss. It doesn't mean I agree with the loss. I will never agree with the loss. I will never agree with the loss of the pandemic, but I may be able to find meaning with this loss. So it's meaning after the loss. And
Yes.
again, this might happen for people. Let's say you did have a child that passed away. You may be then going to that high school where your child went and explaining the effects of drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
That's how I coming on here for myself, I lost my brother when I was 16 years old. So I've been through grief and loss. So me being able to talk about grief and loss during a time of, a pandemic is my way of finding meaning back to help others navigate their way through it. Another example would be, let's say you're going to run a 5K and run awareness and funding for leukemia because your grandmother died of it. That would be finding meaning. So there's many ways that we can find meaning that doesn't take away from the significance of what we went through.
Thank you so much for sharing about your own experience as well. And it's always so incredible to chat with people who have really found energy and motivation and meaning and purpose from the challenging moments that they've experienced in their life. So I appreciate you sharing that. Okay,
Mhm.
going back to the three U's, you mentioned the first one, which is universal, the second one, which is unique. What is the third U?
The third U is that it's uncertain. We have so much uncertainty because the life that we were living is no longer there. And that's very real for all of us right now in this pandemic. Our normal is not normal anymore. Just like there was pre 9/11 and post 9/11, we are definitely going to have pre COVID and then post COVID.
Yeah.
So uncertainty, and I don't know if I can turn my like my phone and my ring light over here. I have a whiteboard, so this is how I explain
Perfect.
for your viewers since we're doing a video recording. I
Yeah.
think it is a spectrum, right? And so on one end, I'm going to go this way. Here we go. There, you can see it now. Okay,
Great.
so
Thank
one
you.
end is certainty, all the way on this end, and
Yeah.
then certainty is over on the other end. So we have a very wide spectrum. most of us love having certainty, right? That's why we love our
Yes.
routine. It's
Yes.
predictable. It sets the stage for our day. We can set our intentions, right? We love having certainty because it gives us a sense of control. And if you are a perfectionist, like I tend to be, we really love being on this end of the spectrum,
Yeah.
right? However, life has happened to us. And now we have, as Brene Brown calls it, FFTs or effing first times,
Yes.
where uncertainty and we're here,
Yeah.
and uncertainty for all my perfectionists, this feels vulnerable. I can't control this. It's unpredictable. But here's the thing with uncertainty, and this is what I would really try to remind my patients about. With uncertainty comes possibility. And we have to have the hope of possibility, because we are all being called to redo life in a way that we never knew we needed to redo, that we never knew we needed to look at, that we never knew that we needed to slow down and really collectively be in tune with. And so with uncertainty is a whole host of possibility. And that's what I want everybody.
I just got full body goosebumps. I feel like when we're in that space of uncertainty, which I have to say over the years, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with, because I know that when I'm in a space of uncertainty, that I'm outside of my comfort zone and I'm breaking through that box, right? That comfort box. And it is possible to get more comfortable in the uncomfortable with
Yes.
practice, if that makes sense, with practice, as you start to build trust and everything. That being said, in a period of grief or loss, people don't want to be in that uncomfortable space, that on that side of the spectrum, for very long. I imagine when you're talking to people who are in that grieving process, that a common question that must come up is like, how do I move through this faster? I am not comfortable in this space. Get me back into my comfort zone. What do I do in order to expedite this period of grieving? So do you have any thoughts on that? Can we speed up the process? what what are the tools and tricks for getting through grief?
Well, one of my favorite tips, specifically when it comes to uncertainty, is that because people, this feels, like I said, very uncomfortable, like you're just highlighting here. People are like, how do I get through this? Like, I don't want to feel uncertain. And the reality is, you've actually been through uncertainty before. You just didn't know it. Just like you didn't know you've been through loss before. And this is what I have people do, is to get out a piece of paper and ask themselves this really important question. What have you been through? What have you overcome when you didn't know the outcome to? So what have you overcome already in your life when you didn't know the outcome? And the reality is, we have so many examples in our past to show us that we've been through uncertainty before. For instance, I bet when you got married, you didn't know the outcome, right? I mean, we're hoping for the best. We're hoping that our marriage is going to work out, but we really don't have a guarantee that it's going to work out well. Or if you've become a mother, you don't know the outcome. You again hope that you're going to make it through the day, but you really don't know. But little by little, one step in front of the other, and you figure it out. When you took that new business adventure, when you took on that new business project, when you took on that new do-it-yourself home improvement, you didn't know how it was going to turn out, but you did it anyways. So you have overcome uncertainty time and time again. You just didn't identify it as uncertainty. So going to past experiences and coming up with past evidence can really help a person feel much more safe in their emotional experience.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, just being able to breathe in the space that they're currently in. Okay, so they're in this space of uncertainty, they're grieving. Let's use the example of a parent being lost, or somebody has, lost somebody from COVID, for example. And we're talking about that kind of loss.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can absolutely see how understanding and acknowledging and recognizing that you've been through hard things before, that you can get through this period of time as well, is going to be so pivotal in giving you the strength to continue forward. Is there a series of stages that we have to go through in regards to grief in order to pass through it? And again, I'm going to ask the question. This is such an Erin question. How do we get through it faster? How do we move through it? Are there things that we can do to support ourselves during that time?
Well, it's really important to know that grief is not something that there's no end. It's a part of you. Just like love is a part of you, like you always will love, you will always grieve once you lose someone or something that had meaning. So what I can do is I'm going to erase this and I'm going to start to walk you through each stage of grief so that you and your audience knows exactly what the stages are. Okay, so
great.
the first stage is denial. Okay, so again, these stages are not something that I developed. These stages are tons and tons and tons of anecdotal research developed originally by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And so she first identified denial. So denial is the idea that we are wanting to live in our preferred reality, not our real reality. Real reality is painful, but our preferred reality. So let's take the example of a person who has been betrayed by their partner in a case of infidelity. So there may be like, how could this happen? There's no way that he could have done this. There's no way she could have been lying all this time. Right? So that is the denial. You don't want to be in your reality because the reality is so painful. So you want to think and stay in your preferred reality.
And I can even think right now, almost everyone, as coronavirus was starting to happen, was likely in denial. This isn't actually happening. We're not going to get sent home from work. This isn't going to come to the US. This isn't going to be a part of Canada. And then all of a sudden you're actually living it. So that's a less traumatic example of how, denial might show up or come into play.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, there may be still people living still in denial.
Yeah.
Even with all the deaths and all the, the research, like they're still like, oh, it's not me. I'm not going to get it.
Yeah.
It's blown out of proportion.
Yes.
So, I with young adults in college and I mean, a lot of young adults are like, what's the big deal? I really don't understand it. And so there is this sense of denial. Denial protects us. Denial protects us from the reality that we are in because, again, the reality is too painful.
Gotcha. Okay. So stage 1, denial.
Stage 1's denial. The second stage is anger. So anger is the second stage in the stages of grief and loss. And the reason that anger starts to, I think, collect is because now we're starting to move into our reality briefly. And anger gives us something to control, something to blame. And we're feeling so, in a sense, powerless with denial. Anger brings us back to that sense of control. So we want to say, well, it's your fault that this happened. Right? We want to cast blame. We want to be angry because it gives us a sense of like this power.
That totally makes sense. I think going back to that spectrum that you had of control and lack of control in an experience where we're moving into that uncertainty on the spectrum, we're going to try to want to find control in some way. And one of the ways of doing that is to, as you said, blame something else, point the finger, and find a reason as to why this is happening, right? Like as human beings, we don't like that uncertainty. So we need to find something to blame or some reason for why it's happening.
Yeah. And a perfect example, with grief and with death, we want to blame the medical team. We want to blame the doctor. We want to blame the universe. We want to blame God. We want to blame the driver. We want to blame our bodies. We want to blame, whatever we can. Let's say you experience a miscarriage. How many times have women blamed their bodies?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a very, very natural, common reaction for women when they've gone through something so traumatic as that. So yes, we want to have anger, and anger again gives us that energy and that fuel. And then the third stage is bargaining. I'm sorry, my handwriting is not that great, so you have to bear with me.
It's perfect. It's perfect. I love it.
Bargaining is the third stage. So bargaining is really interesting because we get into this place where we're pleading. We're pleading with the universe. If I do this, will you give me that? So if I become sober, can you get this person back in my life? Let's say you were working with an alcoholic. If I am a better Christian, can you please bring back the person that I love? if I go to therapy and get help, will you take me back in the marriage? Let's say we're looking at infidelity, right? So
Mm.
we're begging, we're trying to make an agreement with God, with the universe to get back what we lost.
This is resonating so much as you're writing this cycle out with somebody that I love who's gone through um, some a pretty couple of hard years in her own marriage around infidelity, and just recognizing this pattern and the stages that her partner was going through as they dealt with that is it's just such an aha moment for me that he was
Yeah.
grieving the loss of what was happening, and his
Absolutely.
emotions fully showed that.
Yeah. And you can have
Wow.
both partners going through their own grief cycle. The person who, made the betrayal and the person who's the victim of the betrayal, right?
Right.
And I've explained too with some of my people that have been in infidelity and, the betrayal is that like in here in this space, we can have obsessive thinking. So we get into like, we're just constantly thinking about it, trying to gather information, going through the text messages, going through the phone records, going through everything we can in our head to go back in time to say, like, wait a minute, when they said they were in New York, were they alone or were they with this mistress? Or
Yes.
when he took that phone call at 7 a.m. in the morning, was that really his mom or was
Mm.
that her? So
Yes.
you start obsessing, and then the person who's been victimized gets really angry, like really angry at themselves or really angry at their partner. And then, you have the bargaining, like, how did I not see this? Only if I had more attention, then I wouldn't have gone through this.
Mm.
Yes.
Can
I,
you can you move back around the circle as well? Like, can you go denial, anger, denial, bargaining, anger, and like
yeah,
bounce around between all these things?
yes. And I love that you brought that point up. So when I get the more stages, I'll show you. But yes, so these are not linear.
Right.
So oftentimes people think we go to A to B to C to
Yeah.
D. No. You can go every which way. And then you also can have your favorite kind of holding space. Let's say like you really love denial because
Yeah.
denial, it feels safe. And you just don't want to do like, you're like, I don't want to know. I just don't want to know. I don't want to
Yeah.
know what he's doing. I just want to move on.
Yeah.
Right. So denial might feel really good for you. Where anger is like, no, I want someone to be accountable and responsible for what happened to my child.
Yeah.
You'll see, where we go into the legal system and things like that. And again, a person has every right to be in their anger, but then maybe they were able to, get the legal, ramifications that they needed, but now they're angry at their partner. Or maybe they're angry at, because you're not grieving the way that I think you should be grieving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You can see when a family goes through loss of a child, I've often heard that it's very common for a relationship to fall apart after that. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. You'd think that, you join together to get through that. But as I'm hearing this, it's like, of course, things would get complicated because, as you said, the individuals are moving through their own process of grief, and that looks different for everybody. And it would be so easy to start to blame or to start to become resentful of somebody else's pattern of grief or the length of time that they're grieving or what that looks like for them. So, this is just bringing so much clarity to me in regards to how this can impact not only individuals, but partnerships. And again, looking outward into our global collective grief that we're experiencing right now and the reactions that different people are having and their responses to everything that's going on.
Yeah, and I love that point you brought up, Erin, because having been in a home where my parents lost their child, their only
Yeah.
son. My parents did divorce a year after the death of my brother. And here's what I've learned about this, and this is what the research shows. It's not the death of a child that causes a divorce.
Mm.
It's the judgment about the death. So it's our judgment about how that person is or is not experiencing the death of the child.
Right.
So what I know with working with so many people who've been through traumatic experiences, judgmental people are traumatized people.
Mm.
So it's very natural for us to judge because when we have been traumatized, we go into our fight, flight, or freeze response. And the most natural reflex is self-protection. And
Right.
we don't become empathic. We don't become compassionate. That takes effort. That takes mindfulness,
Yes.
conscious healing. We go into judgment of ourselves and or judgment of others.
Mm.
Because if I judge you, there's no way I can I'll be emotionally vulnerable and or emotionally intimate.
Right.
So self-protection is a natural reflex that allows for judgment to show up. So that's what I remind so many people when I'm working with them, is that judgmental people are traumatized people. So every time I judge something about you, it reveals an unhealed part within me.
That's so interesting. Where would you say judgment falls in this cycle of grief? Is it a form of anger? Is it a form of, or does it not quite fall in this
It,
category or cycle?
to me, judgment kind of falls into anger, bargaining, and then the next one also is the sadness.
Right.
So
Yeah.
sad can also be judging, because if I'm a parent, I've lost my child, and I don't want to clean their room. I don't want to pack up their belongings. I want their room to stay the exact same way,
Yeah.
right? Again, the judgment could be, well, the dad's like, we've got to move this away. Like, you can't, we have to move on. And then the sadness is, no, I'm not ready to. The feelings of hopelessness and helplessness are very real for that person. And it's really important that we make the distinction here that if a person is experiencing depression, that does not mean that they are experiencing a depressive or major depressive episode. It means it's in relation to the bereavement and grief that they are experiencing.
Okay. So that can also fall under that stage of sadness, but it looks a little bit different than the depression that we're normally talking about in regards to mental health. It's
Correct.
a reflection of the sadness.
It's a reflection of sadness. Yes.
So when somebody's in this traumatized state of fight or flight and going through this cycle of grief, whether it's a friend or a partner or a parent who's lost their parent, how do we best support somebody who's in that stage? I mean, when I think about people in my life who've experienced loss, there are certain people who have done it very privately and maybe, reached out the odd time, but it seems like their grieving process all happened behind closed doors. And then there's the people who seem to need a lot more support. But any tips or advice on how you support somebody who's in that traumatized state?
Yes. And I actually talked about this on my Instagram as well. And one of the things that is what research shows it's going to be so helpful for people is to ask, how can I support you? Or I think oftentimes, and this comes through research from Brene Brown, we think that if we bring up the person that is no longer with us, let's say it's the death of a person, we think that we shouldn't talk about them, that we shouldn't bring them up. And the reality is that it's actually very comforting to the person, although it might be emotional. It feels good to be able to talk about the person that they miss, the person that they lost.
Yeah. And to have that door open for that conversation, because I'm sure in moments they feel very alone in their grieving process and unsure about whether or not they should bring it up, or will I get emotional if I talk about this? And does anybody want to hear about this right now? Where it's still so real for them and still so
real,
charged,
Yes. What we don't want to do is we don't want to give unsolicited advice. We don't want to minimize the severity or the significance of their experience. Like time heals everything, and making these kind of like positive psychology or kind of
yes.
Well, at least they're better off. They're no longer suffering. Well, that may be true, but you're suffering, right? And for many people, that's not where their mind goes, and so really important to again just be there, listen, support, validate, and not try to, because if I always remind my patients this, like if you're trying to mitigate or minimize another person's suffering or pain, that says more about you than it does them.
Yes, this was such a huge aha moment for me, and in regards to something else where I became aware that I was trying to manage somebody's behavior because it was making me uncomfortable. And so I think this is in relation to what you're saying right now, where if we're trying to minimize, and we're doing it from like a place of kindness and love, of course, but at the end of the day, what they're experiencing is perhaps making us uncomfortable. And so we hope that by, helping them move along faster or shift out of the place that they're in and that emotion, that we will feel better as an individual.
Absolutely. And a classic case is parenting. Child is hurt, your child's upset, you're trying to make your child feel better. But really, it's okay to meet for you to meet where your child is at, right? Not trying to get your child to where you want them to be, but to meet them where they are at.
So can you give us some examples of the language that we would use? Because I think sometimes people they just don't have the tool of the language or the sentence or what it sounds like to validate somebody's emotion without trying to fix it or offer a solution or mitigate, the experience. So pretend I was expressing, that I was really struggling and, was just having a hard day in regards to some form of loss. How would you respond to me in a way that's helpful?
It would make total sense that you're really struggling right now. Yeah, there's many reasons why it's hard for you to get through your day. I can see how painful this must be for you right now.
Amazing.
Those would be probably, again, it's just, the
how
person.
How can I help?
Yeah. Well, you can offer what would be helpful for you to hear from me? What would be helpful for me to help you with? Like, can I do anything? How can I support you? Maybe sometimes it's just listening, just having the ear to hear and not, again, trying to rescue, trying to fix it, and just being there with them in that emotional experience. Like if I see my daughter who's 8 years old and she's upset with a friend of hers, I'm not going to try to tell her what to do. I'm first going to say, where does it hurt? Tell me in your body where it hurts you right now, because grief starts in our bodies. And that's a really important thing, is that we don't recognize that because we just think we have a headache, or that, maybe I'm coming down with something, or my stomach hurts, or I'm just not feeling overly well. But really, grief starts in our bodies. And so I'll ask my children, where does it hurt in your body? Can you show me? And then maybe they'll, point to their heart or their head or their tummy and say, okay, let's take a deep breath. Why don't you tell me what happened today? And then they'll talk about what happened today. God, that had to be really upsetting for you. I'm so sorry to hear that. Tell me what you did. Tell me what do you think was, helpful for you? What was not helpful for you? So again, you can word it in a language that's appropriate for your child. With children, we can have them draw their feelings. And then again, I like to always move our bodies, and I developed an online digital course for grief and loss. And that was one of the big components of my course, is to make sure that people have these body release exercise videos to help them release the stress that gets accumulated from grief and loss.
Okay. Is this online course still available?
Yes. I just launched it 2 weeks ago. So
exciting.
A promo code to all your followers to get $100 off the course.
Amazing. This is such a helpful tool and so needed by so many. So I'm so happy to hear that there is, a space that people can go to after. And I just, full disclosure, had no idea that this course was available before we decided to do this episode. No. So this is an amazing surprise. As I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh my God, I am a classic fixer. And I've become more aware of this in the last year, but I almost have an uncomfortable reaction in my body when I think about just listening and then keeping my mouth closed and not trying to fix it. And I've done this since I was a little girl, right? Like when my parents get in an argument of some sort, try and fix it. When my little sisters are feeling upset, try and fix it. And when my kids are hurting, try and offer solutions to help them fix it. But really, it is so much more empowering to provide and create space for people to step into their own strength, to figure out their own solutions, knowing that you are standing there ready whenever they need to. But for you to not offer the solution is really saying, I believe in you. I trust you. I know that you're going to get through this, and I'm here when you need me.
Yes. Oh, I've got chills now. That's it. That's it. That's all you can do. It's all you can
And
do. And it's the most helpful response, just to let them know that you're there for them, to not try to go in and fix it, to take their pain away, and just to learn to tolerate your own uncomfortable feelings with that. And that's beautiful, Erin. Exactly.
mm. So before we sort of wrap this episode up, is there anything else that you feel is really helpful for individuals who are going through this cycle of grief, or it's
Yeah.
less of a cycle, more like bouncing around in there?
Yeah.
You
So there's
mentioned that grief is something that stays with us forever, but does the intensity of it uh, start to lessen? Like, what is the experience as time passes?
It's a great question. And honestly, I've seen all different ways of it being played out. For me, it's been, it's 20 years since I lost my brother. So, I mean, if this, I wouldn't be sitting up here in front of all of you if this was, 2 years with even in the loss of him. So, you know, again, yes, I think over time we're able to tolerate it. But the reason I'm able to tolerate it is because I've done the work. I have felt my feelings. I allow myself to cry. I allow myself to get angry, sad, bounce around wherever I need to bounce around. And so, again, like our grief is unique. So your grief is unique to you, just like my grief is unique to me. So my sister may have a different trajectory over what this looks like for her. So
Yeah.
we experience something that's universal, right? We both lost our brother, but our grief is unique, and that's the second you. And there's lots of uncertainty as to how it's going to look for all of us.
Mm.
So that's why the 3 U's I think are so important, because it doesn't put boundaries or time limits on our grieving experience.
Mm. I love it. Amazing. This has been so, so helpful. And for anybody out there who is grieving, no matter what that looks like, or however it is presenting in your body, it's so important to know that you're not alone in this experience. And as Dr. Francis mentioned, this is something that is universal, that is experienced by everyone. So, even if you're on your own trajectory or your own path, it's all right, as in there's no right or wrong way to grieve. It's all valid. And there is support out there for you if you need it. Do not hesitate to reach out, as you mentioned at the beginning. Just because you feel like your experience is different than somebody else's doesn't mean that your feelings aren't valid. So you can head on over to Dr. Francis's Instagram page, your website. Can you share those handles for everyone so that they've got them?
Yeah, so my Instagram is at Dr. Morgan Francis, and my website is www.scottsdalepremiercounseling.com. And there's a couple things that I have free available for people. If you go to my link in bio, there is an exercise about how to work through the circles of control. You were talking about control earlier, so it's a free template that they can practice. That template is also available in my online course, Loving Yourself Through Loss, which is that digital course that takes you through all the 5 stages, now 6 stages of grief. It's a downloadable workbook. There is tons and tons of content. And the modules are small. There's about 25 modules, and they're about 5 minutes a piece. So you can take your
Perfect.
time. And then also I have what's called mindful messages. So mindful messages are free text messages straight to your phone from me, as a way for you to move into your conscious healing, to not forget to take care of yourself. They're words of encouragement and wisdom. And so I can also give you that number, Erin, too. And again, it's a free service. You just
Oh,
text it,
yes.
text message, it goes right into your phone.
Yes, we will make sure that all of this is in the show notes. So it's super easy for you to access it. As always, I want to make sure that you girls have all the tools that you could possibly need to support you, from a host of incredible, incredible women. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's always such a pleasure to have you on the show. And I always have so many takeaways every time that we chat. If you also found that you had some aha moments or some takeaways that might support somebody else who is grieving, or who has experienced loss in their life, please take a moment to forward this conversation on to them as a way of showing support. You can also click subscribe so that every single one of our episodes lands in your device for free. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye. Okay.